Hey guys, so this is our first lesson on South Africa, where we are recording it. So what I'm going to do first is just run through the sort of homeschool structure, just so that you're aware of what you need to do and what you can expect from the lessons. So the first thing is, it's really important that we try to complete the course as much as possible during these times, because we don't want to be behind as we go into year 13 next year. We also don't know how long we're going to be out for, and the last thing we need is to have massive gaps in our knowledge. It is a massive shame. I would much rather be in the classroom with you, teaching you about all of this. I really love our lessons together, and they're a massive highlight to my week. So it's sad, but at least we still get to do history in some capacity. So this is what you need to do in order to get the most out of these recordings and out of these lessons and our lesson time. So ensure you have your book open and write the title and date as usual. So this is quite important because you need to make sure that your notes are as structured as possible, and this is one of the best ways to achieve that. I'm going to tell you when to pause. So as you're listening to the video, just pause when instructed even, and complete the task. You know that you're more than welcome to message me if you have any issues, so just keep me posted. Don't just sit there and be confused. I'm here to help you. Everything must be completed. I'm actually going to say not within 3 days of the lesson. I'm going to say within 2 days of the lesson, because you guys obviously have access to your own devices, so you should be able to just follow this along on your iPad quite easily. And also, I think this is a really important point. You need to make sure you're on top of your work. You're still doing an A-level, and unfortunately you're doing an A-level at home, which is going to be really hard. So in order to mitigate against confusion, you need to make sure that you're following your timetable as much as possible. Seriously, keep that routine going, because it's going to be hard if you're not getting up at the same time every day. You're not following a strict timetable. Some students are actually setting an alarm every 50 minutes just so that they're aware of the nature of the passing of time. So as much as possible, complete this work during our usual lesson time, so Thursday, period 5 and 6. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at this lesson is we're looking at Sharpeville and the aftermath of Sharpeville. So as we can remember, Sharpeville was the massacre of about 69 Africans who were protesting against passers, and it resulted in a very extreme indication and an extreme lesson to people in South Africa and around the world about the brutality of apartheid and police brutality as well. So this man here is a man called Beyers Nadir. So Beyers Nadir was an Afrikaner. He was quite a leader actually of the Dutch Reformed Church, having his own parish and being a priest within that parish. His father, Josiah Nadir, was an Afrikaner cleric who helped found and was the first chairperson of the Broederbond. So the Broederbond is the Afrikaans for brotherhood, and it's essentially the Afrikaner men's secret society. So these are the people in charge of translating the Bible into Afrikaans. They're the leaders of the Afrikaner people, but more so behind the scenes. So they might not be in power explicitly, but they're pulling the strings behind people like Malin and Verwoerd and so forth. So this man here is an elite, right? The elder Nadir, so his grandfather, produced the earliest translation of the Bible into Afrikaans. So we're thinking about what this means for Beyers Nadir as a person and what kind of image this constructs of him then. Maybe actually just pause it for a second and have a think about what sort of impression does this background give us with Beyers Nadir. Okay, so I expect you to be thinking, and you'd be right to be thinking, he is the embodiment of an Afrikaner man, right? He is an Afrikaner with the absolute privilege in being an Afrikaner. He is the sort of person who is going to continue his family legacy of promoting Afrikaner nationalism and Afrikaner supremacy, right? And yeah, he does do that for most of his life. So the way that his family did it through the Broederbond, he did it through the church, the other wing of Afrikaner nationalism, the Dutch Reformed Church, until something changes. And that thing that happens... Okay, I don't want to say it. No, stop it. Calm down. All right. So what you're going to do is you're going to watch this Bay is Nadir clip. It's on the Google Drive called Bay is Nadir clip. And I want you to write the subheading, Bay is Nadir interview. Because you're at home, you actually might have time to just watch it and think about it and just experience this clip. It's a really powerful and interesting one. And once you've done that, once you've watched it, just click play again, and then after I've talked about it, you're going to write an answer to those 3 questions. Okay, so just pause for 5 seconds so you can pause the clip and watch the Bay is Nadir clip. Okay, so I think this clip always touches me. It always brings a bit of a tear to my eye. It's very emotional. I think the fact that he's looking back on something that happened 20 years earlier and is crying, reflecting on it, I think it shows just the impact of his sacrifice and what he had to wrestle with morally. So he obviously sees what happens at Sharpeville, and I think for him it's this moment where there is no morality to apartheid. And remember, right back at the start of the course, we looked at this idea that a small vote cannot survive if they see themselves as immoral or unjust. And this is what happens to Bay is Nadir. Sharpeville is his moment of consciousness, his understanding of his role in continuing this perpetual cycle of oppression and racism against the African people. It's his moment where the African people are humanized, when he realizes there is no us and them, there are only people. And as a man of God, he needs to protect all people, not just his own white people. So I think from that moment, he can't get this out of his head. He can't forget that people are being continuously oppressed in South Africa. And he has to essentially tell people in his parish that he cannot stand for this, and he tries to expose the immorality and injustice of apartheid as a result of that. However, the consequences of this do not just affect him. It's not just about him losing his high status in South African society, and the fact that he is so high up and profound and recognised in the community means that, the higher you are, the harder you'll fall, right? So his fall is extremely hard. And it's not just him who suffers as a result, it's his family as well. And he wrestles with this as a problem, wrestles with the fact that his actions will have consequences not just to him, but to his family. So if we're really thinking about this and what this reflects is this idea that as soon as the facade is removed, as soon as the mask comes off of the brutality of apartheid, people start questioning it. And when people start questioning it, it will fall. Although the sharper ones among you must already have worked out that this is the 1960s that this happened. Apartheid didn't fall until the 1990s. So somehow apartheid survives this. But I think this is one of the crucial moments in which the morality of apartheid is chipped away at. So what I want you to do then is I want you to answer those 3 questions in your book. Unfortunately, we can't discuss it, which would have been the best thing to do. But this is the next best thing because it still gets you to think about it and analyse the video you just watched. So I'm going to let you pause it for a minute and answer those 3 questions in full sentences in your book. So another notable Afrikaner of this time period is a man called Bram Fischer. So he, again, just like Bay is Nadir, had a Afrikaner background, and he was a descendant of major Afrikaners as well. So his father was the president of the Orange River Colony. So if you remember, South Africa had 3 parts. His father was the president of one of those parts of South Africa. He was also an extremely proud nationalist. He was proud to be South African. However, he too has this moment of consciousness, and he starts to reflect on the actions of white South Africans and what that means to the people in South Africa, especially black South Africans. So he is a lawyer, and he decides to represent the ANC leaders during the trial. Now, I think this is quite important because by having somebody so high profile and a high profile white person representing the ANC leaders during the trial, it kind of helps their case a bit more. So the ANC, I don't if you remember when we read their defense, and it was about promoting the idea that they are not a racist organisation, that they are multiracial, so that they support the idea of integration, and thus the ANC are not a threat to South African society. So having someone like him advocate for them as well as obviously Mandela using it as a platform, is quite powerful in creating not just sympathy within South Africa, but also the international community as well. It's not necessarily right, obviously, that they need a white face to make them look more appealing to the world. However, that was the reality at the time, and actually probably still is right now. So he's a very powerful advocate of multiracialism in South Africa, and he was an important ally to the ANC leaders during the trial as well. And he talked about fascism. So fascism, the idea that your people are better than other people. He says fascism is a cancerous nationalism, and it definitely is, in the sense that it's this idea that our people are better than everybody else. And just like cancer, it eats away at society. Nothing good can ever come at having such a factional society like that. It will always crumble. It will always fall, because it is immoral. And if people find their system is immoral, they will eventually stop advocating for it. Especially if you look at South Africa as a democracy, they had to vote to support these apartheid policies. So what happens then is Mandela and the 8 other prisoners, should have been executed for their actions as in the MK, because sabotage was considered to be terrorism, and terrorism is punishable by death. However, the court case was so compelling because of the actions of the defendants as well as the lawyer. It meant that they were but they were given life in prison. However, the effects of this is that Mandela and the ANC and MK leadership end up becoming neutralised. There's not a lot they can do in prison, and they're essentially exiled on Robben Island in a prison where they have very little contact with the outside world. He can't see his children because they're too young to come and visit him in prison. Visits aren't very frequent because of the nature of the travel to get there as well, because you have to travel by boat and the sea is often quite treacherous, so you have to get the weather just right to get there. And also the fact that he can't fully communicate with the outside world as well. They can't even get access to political newspapers, and they're very much left in the dark while they're on Robben Island. So the ANC and MK leadership, as well as the PAC as well, are neutralised. They're gone. There's not much that they can do. They more or less disappear into the world. So what I want you to do is just pause it and write down notes based on what's on the slide, as well as what I've just said. Okay, so it's not all bleak in a sense, right? And I think the actions of Sharpeville are so significant, not necessarily because they created some major change, because there are a lot of reasons for that not happening in the 1960s, which we will discuss. And, it seems like it's pretty dire, the fact that, these people are put in prison, the ANC are in the wilderness. They're pretty much inexistent and pointless within South Africa after the 1960s. However, the impact of Sharpeville is this idea of a moral searchlight. So you have this idea then of South Africa, and this is what they're advocating. This idea of, visions of future equality. So through separate development, South Africa promised that you have the white South Africa, you have black South Africa. You shouldn't give them the same things that white people have, because that's not fair. You should let them develop on their own. Let each different civilization flower separately. And then as a result of this, you will eventually have equality. It's their responsibility to create that equality though. And, as people were hearing this, they're like, yep, that sounds great, right? We're 2 different races. Why should we have to be together? It doesn't make any sense. That's fine. However, what starts to happen then is, obviously we can all understand that this is just absolute nonsense, right? This is just a mask. This is just a fallacy. It's complete lies. It's circumlocutory language, right? So what happens with Sharpeville is you start to have this moral searchlight form, and it shows that it's not actually this idea that, yeah, Africans are happy with this idea of separate development, because it indicates that the only way that it can actually be achieved is through force. The fact that you have all these people, thousands of people protesting in Sharpeville, about 5,000-6,000 people protesting, proves that Africans are not happy with this promise of separate development. It uncovers the lies, and it proves to the world that South Africa and apartheid can only be governed through force, through brutality, and the fact that separate development is not true. There is development for white people and non-development for black people in South Africa. And Sharpeville does this, and it proves this to the people in South Africa, so people like Beyers Nadir, people like Bram Fischer, but it also proves it to people around the world as well. So what I want us to do now then is we're going to write down this title. So the title is How Effective Was the Moral Searchlight in International Support for Africans? So it might have shaken people like Beyers Nadir, but that was a fairly small change. But what about internationally? So the person who we're going to look at in terms of Prime Minister at this time is John Vorster. So Verwoerd gets the cut. He dies. Oh no, how sad. And he is replaced by John Vorster, who is actually very much quite a terrifying fanatic, just like Verwoerd was, but he's a bit different, but we'll look at that as we go. But anyway, so Vorster then, sorry, I shouldn't say historian 2017. So Vorster was the Prime Minister, South African president, at this time. And he said, England is the team of the anti-apartheid movement. Okay, so what I want you to do is pause it, write down the quote and write down the title. Okay, it's quite an interesting statement that he's making there, the team of the anti-apartheid movement. So he's criticising England. Why? Why is he criticising England? What is the anti-apartheid movement, and why is that being criticised as well? So what we're going to look at then is a case study, a man called De Oliveira. We're going to look at his story, and we're going to see what does that tell us about relations after Sharpeville. So De Oliveira was a cricketer, and you're going to find out more about him from when you watch the clip, okay? And it's about the England cricket team touring South Africa in 1966. So I want you to pause it now, and when you pause it, I want you to watch the clip, and I want you to jot down notes from the clip. Once you've done that, I want you just to answer this question here. So what does his story tell us about relations after Sharpeville? Okay, so just pause it, watch the clip, and answer that question. Okay, so it starts to become unpalatable, this idea of racial segregation within sports teams as well. And this creates a massive controversy around the world. So what starts to happen then is you start to have sport in South Africa becoming a target of people who are against apartheid. So you have, if you look at these two photos, you have the cricket teams, in South Africa they had two cricket teams. They would have a white South African cricket team, and they would have a coloured cricket team, an Indian cricket team, and a African cricket team. So when it came to segregation or apartheid, when it came to apartheid in South Africa, it was so specific and pedantic, right down to sport. Absolutely everything in South Africa was separated by race, including all sports teams as well. So obviously with De Oliveira, that caused a massive stir and controversy in South Africa, okay? So what starts to happen then is, in 1961, South Africa is furious about this idea of trying to integrate sports teams, and they don't want their white players to play against a black player or an Indian player, because that's going to challenge their notions on race. If this black player is more skillful at cricket than the white player, what this does is it undermines the idea that white people are superior to black people. So what starts to happen is people around the world are trying to petition to push South Africa and make South Africa a global pariah, make it so that people want to culturally isolate South Africa and not be involved with them and their sports and their culture or anything. So you start to have them voluntarily, although I say that lightly, and we'll debate that in the next lesson, but withdrawing from the Commonwealth Games. So they stop publicly playing with Commonwealth countries in the Commonwealth Games. You also have this really quite interesting development here. In 1963, FIFA banned South Africa. So South Africa cannot play in the World Cup. And now, wow, that's an amazing achievement. The World Cup, that is probably the most important sporting event around the world. It means so much to so many countries. However, what sport is it? It is football. Wow, okay, South Africa, what sport do they care about? Cricket, they care about rugby. So football, yes, fine, still important to South Africa, but not actually that important. So it's a great development being banned from FIFA, but how much is that actually going to affect the day-to-day South Africans and the sports that they actually care about? You also have in 1964 quite another interesting development. They're banned from the Olympics following internal pressure from South Africa's non-racial Olympic Committee. So they are completely refused to have different races on their teams, and as a result, the Olympic Commission bans them. Now, this is quite unusual for the Olympics because the Olympics used to say, the Olympics approved the Olympic Games in Nazi Germany because they argued politics had no place in sport. They stripped away the titles of people like Tommy Smith for his Black Power symbols. So usually the Olympics are actually quite a reactionary force in terms of politics because they say we don't talk about politics, we just play sport. But here the Olympic Committee actually does step up and do the right thing and ban South Africa from the Olympics. So this is the beginning of South Africa becoming that social pariah around the world. So this is partly the success of the global anti-apartheid movement, which was actually really heavily based in London. So it was formed in London in 1960, and it had quite a lot of prominent people in it. So former prime minister, people who go on to become prime minister even. You also have a lot of Labour MPs were involved in the global anti-apartheid movement as well. So they commissioned a boycott in 1959, and we're actually going to look at a lot of their posters and a lot of their sources as well. So they proposed this boycott, but the government rejected it. And this was a problem because it was a conservative government at the time. So the Labour MPs, through the pressure group of the global anti-apartheid movement, pushed their agenda and said, can we boycott South Africa? South Africa is killing innocent lives, and yet the government continuously blocked it. So Britain is the focal point, and I think another thing that's so interesting about British history is you have like so many sides to it and so many faces to Britain. And on one side, Britain is constantly the home of exiles, so people fleeing political turmoil in their countries come to England, and London is this hub of intellectuals who are revolutionaries trying to change their countries for the better. And worse sometimes, but so it's a main destination for exiles. So a lot of people from South Africa are actually based in Britain at this time, and you can see here their focus is on the idea of saving these lives. So this was a protest campaign in London, which was about trying to put pressure on the South African government not to hang the people who are on trial for sabotage, including, as you can see there, Mandela. So they're about trying to free the political prisoners and trying to stop them from being executed. And this was heavily mobilised because of the reports coming in about the Sharpeville Massacre. So it's debatable how much impact they had on South Africa making the decision to arrest the prisoners for life rather than execute them, but I think it definitely did play a part. And you can see here at the bottom here, the people protesting against apartheid and people protesting in London against it, which didn't always have a positive response. So what's going to happen then to the African nationalist movement after 1964? So we have here a picture of Mandela in prison in Robben Island. And what I want you to think about is, what are the problems with PAC and ANC leaders being in prison or in exile? So just pause and give that a thought. Okay, so obviously, if the leadership is in prison, they cannot lead. The other leadership who weren't arrested ended up having to effectively run away. So who is there to lead an organised movement within South Africa? Nobody, right? The other thing is there's not even an opportunity for people to step up and lead, because they've just become delegitimized because the fact that they are effectively illegal organizations. There's also that fear that if you stand up and try to lead and create change in South Africa, you're going to end up like Mandela, wasting your life in prison, or more than likely being executed, because his life was only saved because of massive international and internal campaigns as well. So what I want you to do is just write an answer to that question. So just pause it to answer it. Okay, so the other person we're going to look at is Oliver Tambo. So Oliver Tambo essentially becomes the leader of the ANC. However, he has to do this from exile. And it's interesting because, so he initially goes to Botswana in exile, but and eventually ends up in exile in London. And one thing that's quite interesting about Oliver Tambo is his children have an English accent because they grew up in London. So he spends so much of his life fighting for South Africa, but not being in South Africa, which I think is really, really tragic. He becomes considered to be the official representation for South Africa. And he's really clever because he essentially uses his platform quite effectively. He actually gives a speech at the UN, which you're going to read in a minute. And the pressure that he puts on the international community is quite effective. And the UN ends up initiating a resolution for the release of political prisoners. However, as we're going to look at the UN in a bit more detail across this year and next year, UN resolutions are questionable. The UN might say to a country, you need to release all your political prisoners, but it's actually up to the country whether or not they do that, because a country has the right to self-determination. So they have the right to decide their own laws and not have an international body dictating whether or not they do something. So the UN has been criticised as being little more than a talking shop, just a place where countries come together and debate and argue and doesn't really mean anything. So the UN called for political prisoners to be released in 1964, and yet Mandela doesn't come out until 1990. So not fantastic, but is this a step in the right direction, you could argue, which we'll look at later. So what I want us to do now then is I want us to read Tambo's speech, which is on the Google Drive. And I want you to think about, firstly, what is the nature and origin of the source, right? So the nature, it's a speech, it's at the UN. And we're thinking about this in terms of source analysis and what does the impact of the nature and origin have on this speech, right? So what we're actually trying to assess, and I should have written this down actually, is how effective were the ANC after Sharpeville. Okay, so this is the thing that we're investigating. How effective are the ANC after Sharpeville? And we're going to use this source in order to try and figure that out. So firstly, what is the nature and the origin of it? And that's going to give us some clues about how effective they're going to be. The fact that you have somebody who's considered the official representation of South Africa, a black South African speaking for South Africans on the most prestigious international organisation around the world is quite important, right? The origin, so looking at when it was and who is it that's saying it. So talk a little bit about who Oliver Tambo is as the new leader of the ANC. What is the purpose? So what I mean by what is the purpose is, what is Tambo hoping to achieve from this speech? So he's saying this, so what is it that he's saying in it as well? So what is he saying in the speech, and what does that reveal to us about what he's trying to achieve in the speech? Then once you've done that, I want you to answer question 3. What does this reveal about the changing tactics of the ANC? Then, if you want something to think about, I can imagine someone like Natania's going to pick a few issues with this, which is great. I want you to think, is this actually an effective way to protest? How effective is this for the ANC? And I think there are ringings about what Anton Lemdy was saying about them being gentlemen with clean hands. So are there grounds for Lemdy's criticism still in 1964 when they're going out and doing all of these things? Okay, that's fine. So that's the end of the lesson then. So I want you to pause it, answer those questions, and just remember to submit an image of your book once you have finished. Just take a photo of the work that you've done, not the front of your book, although that would be funny, but no, thank you. Okay, any questions, please just drop me a message and let me know. Thank you, bye-bye.